On the bitterly cold early evening of the 19th of January 1988 in East Germany, on a stretch of railway 30 miles south of Berlin, a commuter train smashed into a Soviet T-64 tank which was blocking its path. Both the locomotive and tank were completely destroyed, and the rest of the busy commuter train derailed with mass casualties. Up until now in East Germany and the other Warsaw Pact countries, such an accident would have been covered up immediately by the state, but this accident would be different because the East German government would attempt to exploit it for political means, in a move that would ultimately backfire on them and indeed contribute to the complete collapse of the East German state within 20 months. In this video I'm going to tell the dramatic and horrific story of the Forst-Sena rail disaster 1988. And also its far-reaching political consequences for the Cold War. You can read a bit about the accident online, but not much. So I think the best way to investigate the background, the events of the day and its consequences is to get out into the field ourselves. So I'm going to start this Cold War story off in the town of Luckenwalde. Luckenwalde is an ancient historic German town. Pre-World War II and during the years of National Socialism, it was an important rail hub given its proximity south of Berlin. Hi there and welcome to the town of Luckenwalde, which is in the state of Brandenburg, about 35 miles south of Berlin. This is about as far as I can get to my end destination because the railway has been upgraded in the 30 years since reunification. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take an hour's walk out to the station where I'm intending to do this video. Forst-Sena. Right, let's go and I'll fill you in on the way. My first discovery on researching this video is that the rail station the disaster is named after, Forst-Sena, no longer exists. After German reunification in 1990, the East German rail structure was upgraded to modern standards and the remote Forst-Sena station was considered redundant. So there is now no stop here. This means that the nearest rail station to this area is Luckenwalde. So unfortunately the station of Forst-Sena doesn't exist anymore. So I'm going to have to walk out. It's going to take me about an hour to get out there. Doesn't matter, I'll get to walk through the fairly picturesque town of Luckenwalde, which hasn't really changed much since the days of the DDR. I lucked out in my research because I was able to source this fairly modern, and what I mean by modern is late 1980s, Soviet Army map of the Luckenwalde and Jüterbog military district. Now obviously I can read maps, but another useless skill I've got is I can read Cyrillic, I can read Russian, I can also speak a bit of Russian but not brilliantly. This enabled me to compare and contrast this old Soviet map with present day Google Earth. And that's the basis of where we're going today. So you don't have to try and decipher the Soviet Army map, I've simplified our journey for you here. We're starting our expedition here at Luckenwalde Bahnhof. And we're heading out on foot to the site of the former Soviet Army garrison at Forst-Sena, shaded in red. Until 1991, the areas shaded in yellow were the Soviet Army tank training areas of Forst-Sena. Live fire training in the northwest and dry training only in the southeast. After 1991, when the Soviet Army left, the German government turned these zones into a nature reserve. And finally, note the location of the former Forst-Sena Bahnhof, the station, and particularly the rail line that runs through the centre of the training area between the towns of Jüterbog and Luckenwalde. Well, talk about suffering for your art. I've been walking about an hour and a half now through the forest and we're nearly at the Soviet Forst-Sena garrison. Now, a lot's changed since reunification. For a start, all the major tarmac roads that would have served the garrison have been ripped up as the training area has been turned into a country park. So that makes life a bit harder to get here. There is a federal highway, but it's non-stop, so I couldn't really take a taxi out or take a car out and park. Once you enter the woods from Luckenwalde, you come across signs like this regularly. It says in German, Naturschutzgebiet und ehemaliges militärisches Übungsgelände, nature reserve and former military training area. I'll paraphrase the rest. It says, danger to life and health from collapsing buildings, underground installations and unexploded munitions. Keep to the paths or else. Yep, and you can tell I'm in the right place. Underfoot, I've got pre-World War II German cobblestones, and to my left, Soviet-era prefab concrete walling. And here we are then, the main gate to the Soviet Forst-Sena garrison. Before that, Adolf Hitler Lager in 1933 through World War II. What I'll do now in the video is I think I'll show you the history of the camp under the Wehrmacht and then under the Soviet occupation up until the end of the Cold War. So let's return to the studio to do a full history of this site. So here I am about 4 miles south of the centre of Luckenwalde, outside the main entrance to the former Soviet garrison. Let's take a look at how these gates would have looked in 1988. Typical Soviet barracks of the late 1980s. A slider gate kept closed, embellished with either gold or red stars and the Soviet red flag flying outside. And in the year 2023, the time of filming, yeah, it's gone downhill a bit. After German reunification in 1990, in January 91, the Soviets handed this barracks back to the German federal government, and it's been empty ever since. Like most Cold War barracks in both East and West Germany post-1945, the Allied occupying powers simply took over existing military installations built by the National Socialists. Forst-Sena garrison was no exception, and the garrison was formerly a Wehrmacht tank training school known as Adolf Hitler Lager. Sited strategically next to a railway halt and constructed out of forest land, built in 1933, Adolf Hitler Lager was considered a state-of-the-art military installation. In fact, so proud of the architecture were the Nazis that Wehrmacht soldiers could buy postcards of the barracks to send home to friends and family. You have to give credit where it's due. The National Socialists did know how to build enduring, comfortable, spacious barracks for their troops, and I lived in a similar block for 6 years in the 1980s. The garrison also had sports facilities and an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Even the officers' mess was like a country club. Before I turn into Dr. Mark Felton, I'm going to move swiftly on now to the Cold War, which is why we're here after all. The camp was never bombed during World War II, and it was captured in 1945 intact by the Soviet Red Army. After the end of World War II, because the camp was undamaged, it was used as a sort of communist civil service training centre. But the escalating Cold War in 1951 prompted the Soviet forces to boot the East Germans out and use it as a garrison. This garrison flag is quite modern. It's from around 1989, and it says in Russian, GSVG, Forst-Sena, or in English, GSFG, Group of Soviet Forces Germany, Forst-Sena. Because of its proximity to former Wehrmacht live fire areas to the north and dry tactics training areas to the south, the garrison quickly became the 20th Soviet Army's main training centre. If you are former British forces and served in BAOR, then think of this place as sort of the Soviets' version of Sena Lager. By the end of the 1980s, one of the biggest units in the garrison was the 118th Separate Tank Regiment, which essentially was a tank training regiment for the T-64 main battle tank, and it trained commanders, gunners and driver mechanics. Every year, thousands of conscripts from across the whole Soviet Union posted to the 20th Army in GSFG would start their 2-year conscription by undertaking their T-64 trade training at Forst-Sena. And to finish off my description of the Forst-Sena garrison, I'm going to fly my drone over the present day site, just to give you some scope of how absolutely vast this garrison is. Starting on the southwestern perimeter wall, the drone is now flying northeast, across the hundreds and hundreds of abandoned barrack blocks that now really resemble Pripyat from the Chernobyl exclusion zone. It is interesting how in 35 short years, nature has completely reclaimed this abandoned space. Well, the drone is now flying to a large open area that was known by the Soviets as the tanker drone. If you're an American or British soldier, you'd probably call it a vehicle park. And it was here that a few hundred T-64s were kept in neat rows. Unlike Western armies, the Soviets tended to store their armour outdoors, whereas we preferred to put ours in temperature-controlled hangars. The angle the drone's flying over the tank of drone now is facing towards the railway line. And remember this scene because it will become very important once we start talking about the accident. The final piece of real estate I need to show you before we discuss the accident is Forst-Sena Bahnhof, the station. As you know, I've already told you, it's no longer here in the present day. Redundant from 1991, by around 1997, all the buildings were derelict, so the rail authorities had it demolished in around 2005. But it was quite a large station because it served the whole of the Soviet garrison. It had about 6 lines and sidings, 2 passenger platforms, and even a tank loading and offloading ramp. But like all history, if you know where to look, you can still find traces of what was once here, like this former platform. So it is quite hard to make out because the site has been demolished and is in the process of being rewilded. But behind me would have stood the old 1930s Forrestina station house until it was demolished in 2005. It had been derelict from about 1997 after the construction of the new high-speed line. But it was actually demolished a bit later than that. There is no presence of it now. I can't even show you the foundations, and trees have been planted on the platforms and the site now. But what I'll do is I'll swing the camera around to the right and I'll show you the high-speed rail line now, so you can have that for orientation. It would be nice as a YouTube moment for a train to go past me now, but I'm not that lucky, to be honest with you. And right on cue. Returning now to Forrestina Garrison in 1988, let's take a look at the villain of the piece, the piece of metal that caused the accident, the T-64 main battle tank. Now, rather than show you grainy old photographs all the time, what I wanted to do was do a tour of a T-64 tank in the present day. However, they're in a bit of a short supply in southern England, so the best I can do is this T-72 located in Bovington. The T-72 was the next generation of Soviet main battle tank. Similar in dimension and layout to the T-64, it was, however, more mass-produced, a bit cheaper, and intended by the Soviet Union for export to the Warsaw Pact countries and friendly nations. Taking a tour around our T-72, or today our T-64 substitute, you'll notice the vehicle has a very low silhouette. It's just 2 metres tall, much smaller than a NATO main battle tank of the same era. The vehicle is 6 metres long and weighs around 38 tonnes. It has a 700 brake horsepower diesel engine, but the downside to that is the gearbox is manual, albeit hydraulically assisted, making it a very clunky vehicle to drive. It has a crew of 3, a driver, a gunner and commander. The V-shaped glasses plate at the front is there to deflect water away from the driver's vision block. For night operations, the commander, the gunner and also the driver have first generation image intensified night vision optics, and more about the limitations on first generation II later. We now turn in this part of the video to the tragic events of the 19th of January 1988. My account from this point onwards is taken from the Russian language testimony of Soviet soldiers who were there on the day or who were serving in the 118th Independent Tank Regiment. Be aware that there is a lot of incorrect information online, and I would like to think that my version is the most accurate. To set the scene, around 1600 hours, the Deutsche Reichsbahn, East German, D716 regional express train was departing Leipzig for East Berlin. The train consisted of a DR211 electric locomotive, pulling 13 carriages containing around 450 commuters. The train was due to stop at Jüterbog at around 17:30, but would not stop at Forrestina. Concurrently, 30 miles south at Forrestina, Soviet Army Garrison, the latest conscript driver mechanics training course were due to undertake a night driving exercise, their first. All the new conscript students had been allocated an instructor who would supervise their driving from the tank turret. These instructors, though, were simply Soviet conscript dedushkas. Dedushka is Russian for grandfather and was Soviet Army slang for a conscript that was in his second year of national service. At around 17:30 hours, once the officer conducting the exercise was satisfied that it was dark enough to commence, he gave the order for the T-64s to start their engines and form up in a single file ready to depart on the exercise. The first T-64 to depart for the exercise was to be driven by the weakest student, Soldier A, and this was deliberate. He was also to be given the strongest dedushka to supervise him, who I'm going to call Soldier B. Now, I do know the names of both these soldiers, but I've deliberately chosen not to name them in this documentary because they're both still alive and no doubt both still living with the guilt of this accident 35 years later. It really wasn't difficult to work out why Soldier A was the weakest student on the driver course. 19 years old and reportedly with a nervous disposition, he was from the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, very poorly educated and barely spoke any Russian at all. Soldier B, on the other hand, was 20 years old and had been a T-64 driver for nearly 2 years. He was from the Russian Federative Socialist Republic and a strong soldier. At around 70:40 hours, the officer commanding the exercise gave a flash of a torch to indicate that the first tank should start its circuit. And here's where the accident began to unfold. So the T-64 with its trainee driver and its instructor in the turret would have pulled onto the tank track directly behind me through a gate onto the tankerdrome inside the garrison itself. From here they would have picked up the tank track directly behind me, veered off left towards the railway line and followed the railway line up to the official rail crossing. At some stage the driver had battened down and was now using his night vision block. This is a simulated view of what a first generation image intensified driver's night vision block would have looked like for the driver. What I can't simulate and what is absolutely critical is the lack of depth perception, something humans need to be able to judge movement. An important point to make is that this federal highway to my right was constructed well after reunification. At the time of the accident, there was absolutely nothing between the garrison wall and the railway itself. The tank track from the garrison tankerdrome to the training area ran parallel with the railway line, and it was badly churned up by constant use. This is a photo of the track just east of the station. The sign says in German Achtung Panzer and in Russian Vнимание Tanki. Attention, tanks. To pick up the tank track from the tankerdrome training gate required a sharp right turn just east of Forst Sena station. The track was very prominent and very well marked, and there was a thick hedgerow between the rail line and the tank track, although no physical barriers. Obviously now there is a new rail line laid, however this is roughly the point where the tank track would have veered off to the right. To try and explain what happened next, I'm going to simulate how this would have looked to Soldier B, the instructor, with his head out of the turret. And now to Soldier A, the trainee driver, looking through his first generation image intensified night vision block. Just 5 minutes into the exercise, it was clear to Soldier B that the driver, Soldier A, was in trouble. He couldn't hold the tank straight on a course down the track, nearly leaving the track twice, and he was not applying any of the corrections or instructions given to him by Soldier B. The critical moment came when the T-64 was required to take a right turn and follow the tank track paralleling the railway line towards the training area. Despite Soldier B instructing hard right to the driver, the tank kept going straight, eventually crashing through the hedgerow towards the railway line. Twice Soldier B shouted stop on the intercom, but the tank kept going to no avail. So he took the emergency action, which was to hit the electrical master kill switch, which would have killed the engine. This was the first time Soldier B had used this emergency procedure, so he wasn't to know that the engine would not stop immediately, but would run on under its own power for another 20 to 30 seconds. This, combined with the momentum of the T-64, meant that the tank did not stop before the railway line, but actually on it. The instructor knew that to start a T-64 engine after the kill switch had been thrown was beyond the skills of a trainee, so he would have to take over the driver's position himself. However, on exiting the turret, he found that the driver, Soldier A, was still battened down with his hatch closed. Soldier B banged repeatedly on the hatch to get him to open it, and eventually Soldier A did, in a state of shock. However, before the instructor could get into the driver's seat, he heard a chilling sound along the track to the east. Soldier B knew that to take over the driver's position, start a T-64 engine after the kill switch has been thrown, and then potentially drive a tank that's stuck on the tracks clear was going to take between 2 and 4 minutes minimum. He knew he did not have 2 minutes. So instead, he grabbed his trainee, who was in a state of shock, and tried to make as much distance from the railway line as possible. As Soldier A and Soldier B scrabbled clear of their stricken T-64 tank, 600 metres to the east, the D716 commuter train was at its standard cruising speed of 120 kilometres an hour. Its driver would have absolutely no idea that a 40-ton tank was in its path. At 1750 hours, the D716 train collided with the stricken T-64 at around 110 kilometres per hour. The collision destroyed the locomotive, killing both drivers instantly. The kinetic energy from the collision carried the T-64 200 metres down the track. Carriages 1 to 3 were also destroyed, rending them into twisted metal. The remaining 10 carriages of the train derailed, scattering them concertinaing behind the destroyed locomotive, ending up in and around the station infrastructure of Forst Zena Station, which was badly damaged as a result. Directly behind me now is where the derailed carriages, the locomotive and the destroyed T-64 all came to rest, just up from the signal box and Forst Zena Station itself across the tracks. It was an absolute scene of devastation. As the dust settled, the station staff put out calls for emergency services from Luckenwalde and Jüterbog. Soldiers from the Soviet garrison were first on scene to start the rescue and give medical treatment. But the situation soon turned ugly when passengers who were walking wounded and in deep shock from the collision found the T-64, and it became obvious that the Soviets had caused the collision. Soviet soldiers trying to assist were attacked with rocks and fights broke out. On arrival, the Feuerwehr and the Volkspolizei found it hard to maintain order. Had Soldier A and B been located at this time, they probably would have been lynched. Once information about the accident, and particularly its cause, was passed to central government, something unique happened. Normally in East Germany, a news blackout would have been imposed on a disaster like this. But instead, this time, central government passed the news to the state TV broadcaster to tell the whole of East Germany.
Ein Eisenbahnunglück ereignete sich heute Abend auf der Strecke Leipzig-Berlin. In der Nähe der Ortschaft Forst Zena im Bezirk Potsdam entgleisten aus noch nicht geklärter Ursache gegen 17:50 Uhr 7 Wagen des D-Zuges 716 Leipzig-Berlin-Stralsund, wovon 3 umstürzten. Nach bisherigen Informationen erlitten mehrere Reisende Verletzungen. Sie wurden von der schnellen medizinischen Hilfe ärztlich versorgt und umgehend in naheliegende Krankenhäuser gebracht.
Vermeldet werden der exakte Unfallzeitpunkt, die genaue Zahl der entgleisten und zerstörten Waggons. Dass offensichtlich der sowjetische Panzer Unfallursache ist, wird allerdings noch mit keinem Wort erwähnt. Die Zahl der Toten ist zunächst unklar.
Nach bisherigen Informationen, ich muss diese andere Information korrigieren, kamen 2 Menschen, darunter der Lokführer, ums Leben. 30 Reisende erlitten zum Teil schwere Verletzungen.
In a totalitarian state without a free press, it was quite clear that the information from the scene of the incident was being relayed to state TV news on the highest authority, the purpose of which was to generate a feeling of national tragedy amongst the East German population, and then later, for political reasons, to lay the blame at the Soviet army's door. Another event happened that evening that would have been utterly unthinkable just a couple of years earlier. Soviet soldiers A and B, the T-64 crew, were arrested by the East German police, the Volkspolizei, and taken away to Jüterbog for questioning. The Soviet garrison commander decided not to intervene, realising that anger was rapidly building in the local population over the accident. In the cold light of day the following morning, the final casualty figures could be confirmed. In total, 6 people were killed in the crash, including the 2 train drivers. and 33 received very serious and life-changing injuries. This was actually mercifully low, as although the train was carrying 450 passengers, the front carriages, which were destroyed in the crash, were virtually empty, as people, being lazy as they are, had decided to get onto the centre of the train and not walk up the platform towards the front of the train. Also, because the track was electrified, there was no fire. Over the next few weeks, Soviet Army engineers based at Forsina assisted Deutsche Reichsbahn personnel in clearing the scene and repairing the track. The Soviet Army also installed Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles all the way along the railway line through the training area. Within 10 days, the line was reopened. The political fallout began absolutely immediately. Firstly, the two Soviet tank crew soldiers A and B, were released under investigation by the Volkspolizei. The Soviet Army immediately claimed jurisdiction and whisked them away to the Soviet Union the same day. This angered the DDR government. Now I'm told that both soldiers faced a military tribunal, e.g. a court-martial. Soldier A was acquitted, as his low level of education meant he should never been put in the position of driving a T-64. Soldier B was acquitted, as he could not be held liable in law for Soldier A's actions, and he had done everything he could to remedy the situation. If you go on Wikipedia, Wikipedia says that they were both shot. That is absolute nonsense. They are both alive and well to this day. For their failings in leadership on the run-up to the accident and in its aftermath, the Forstina garrison commander and the commanding officer of the 118th Separate Tank Battalion were both relieved of their commands, and they were redeployed elsewhere in the Soviet Army. The day after the accident, the chairman of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, telephoned East German leader Erich Honecker to apologise. Allegedly, the apology was not accepted, with Honecker flying into a rage and ranting at Gorbachev. The politics behind this are complicated, but in a nutshell, the train crash was just a symptom of the antipathy between the two men. Honecker was a communist hardliner, and he was vehemently opposed to Gorbachev's reform agenda in the Soviet Union, perestroika and glasnost. Honecker was also against normalising of relations with the West, and in particular the USA. The DDR was in deep financial crisis, and what Honecker wanted was more centralised economics, not less. Also, Honecker knew that he did not have the consent of the East German people to rule, and the Berlin Wall was a very obvious example of state oppression. If the USSR started to soften its control over its population, there would be contagion throughout the East. Honecker attempted to leverage the Forstina rail crash to threaten Gorbachev that the Soviet Army's presence in East Germany depended on greater East German authority and respect. East German state media openly blamed the Soviets for the Forstina crash, which was fair enough, they were to blame. But this was to try and foster anti-Gorbachev feeling amongst the East German people. As a result, relations deteriorated, to the point where the Soviet newspaper Sputnik was actually banned in the DDR for allegedly spreading lies about the East German government. In July 1989, with relations between Honecker and Gorbachev absolutely ice cold, out of duty, Gorbachev attended the 40th anniversary celebrations of the founding of the DDR state. But the East German population had had enough, and the national protest movement was growing exponentially. Within 4 months, the Berlin Wall would fall. Ironically then, Erich Honecker fled to Moscow to claim asylum and try and avoid trial for crimes against his people. To finish off this video, I wanted to do my outro in front of a memorial to the disaster victims, to remember them as victims of the Cold War. But there is no memorial, and certainly not at Forstina. And I even spoke to local Germans and nobody knows of one. It's almost as if nobody wants to remember the events of the DDR. And it's also ironic that what there is 200 metres away from the accident site is a decaying Soviet monument to the October 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. So I guess I'm going to have to show you that instead. I'm not an urban explorer. It's far too hazardous, too much asbestos, dodgy fallen walls and security guards chasing you around for me to be bothered with that. But I thought I would show you this Soviet garrison monument that's located in the woods just outside the garrison walls itself. You wouldn't know it was here unless you could find it on Google Maps. What I'll do is I'll dismount the camera and show you around it. I find this memorial fascinating. It's like exploring ancient Egypt. On each concrete panel is an artwork frieze depicting a triumph of communism, such as space exploration or, in this panel, shipbuilding and heavy industry. Now overgrown and deserted, I imagine 30 years ago that this would have been surrounded by ornamental gardens, flagpoles flying the Soviet flag. I also find it quite poignant, and I'm not sure how to express this, that 300 metres in the woods from the site of the Four-Seater crash is a picture of the man whose ideology ultimately caused it, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin.